This is gonna be the hottest take I've ever had, most likely, but DSP is 100% right about Baldur's Gate 3. It's interesting seeing people like try and dispute this and kind of downplay this, but here we have Phil, a completely normal person. Well, normal being a YouTube live streamer. Someone who plays a ton of games, who has a lot of experience with them, who's generally pretty good at explaining whether a game is good or bad. You have this guy, right? Someone who has a lot of experience, knows what he's talking about, and will tell you, right, if a game has any real serious problem or if a game is great, right? Phil is not a reliable source of information, but I find it really, really interesting how, in spite of it being the only reason he's making any money at all right now, DarkSydePhil is perfectly willing to come out over and over again and tell people that he's not enjoying Baldur's Gate 3, that it's too slow, that there's not all that much going on, that it's not that great of a game, right? And it's interesting to me because everybody in the community wants to blame Phil for this because it's Phil, but to me, this is like the same kind of energy I felt when he was going after Street Fighter V, where he was openly telling people that, like, yeah, this game isn't as good as 4, it's not as good as the classic games, this is a huge disappointment, yada, yada, yada. And, like, initially, there was a lot of pushback from the community, right? Like, oh, DSP doesn't know what he's talking about, it's DSP, blah, 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 blah. But, like, the reality was, Phil was 100% right, right? The actual professional FGC shills, right? The people who, like, play fighting games for a living, like, they were trying to defend Street Fighter 5 throughout its entire run, right? And now that like Street Fighter 6 is out, these same people who defended 5 so long are like finally acknowledging that like 5 wasn't good and they're happy 6 is out. But like Phil was there telling us that 5 wasn't good the entire time, right? So in that way, like I think Phil does deserve a lot of props for like being willing to stand up to the mob the way he does, right? And I think this is another repeat of that kind of situation in which like the CRPG fan base, the community, like the people who desperately wanted Baldur's Gate 3 to succeed and love to pretend that it did, right? The people who want to believe that Baldur's Gate 3 is the best game released in 2023, it wasn't even close. Those people really, really don't appreciate people like myself or Phil coming out and saying, yeah, this doesn't look good, right? It doesn't look impressive. There's nothing about this that's new or interesting or fresh or exciting. Like, it's just the same thing Larian has always done, right? It's a game where you roll dice and get a result, right? It's D&D. It's not particularly innovative. It's not particularly fun. It's not well thought out. It's degenerate. Like Baldur's Gate 3 was hyped up as something special, and yet there really is nothing from the community that really emphasizes that at all. Right? All anybody wants to talk about is how it allegedly won a Game of the Year award and how it has bear sex, right? And that's what it comes down to, right? That's what Phil is acknowledging in his videos when he talks about this. Is that like, yeah, Baldur's Gate 3 is only relevant because of the sexual content. And he's right about that because that's all anybody did when talking about the game, right? It's kind of like the Nier Automata thing all over again, where like whenever people would talk about the game, they would like deflect to like 2B's ass. Like, oh, what's the combat like? Oh, you don't notice the combat because you're too busy looking up her skirt. Well, what's the plot like? Oh, you mean her ass? Like, but what do you actually do in the game? Oh, you spend the entire time looking at your player character's ass. Like, that was the Nier Automata experience, right? And it was ridiculous. It was absurd. It's continuing even today, actually. It's kind of embarrassing, but when you look at what these people are doing, when you're looking at like the situation with these gamers, when you see like the general pattern, like what seems to be happening is that people who are addicted to like consuming products, right? The consumers, right? Like they will jump on the bandwagon of anything that seems like is popular or is doing well. They'll watch a bunch of streamers playing the game and doing like first time reactions to it, and then they'll kind of forget it entirely, right? And that seems to be what happened with Baldur's Gate 3, with Pow World, with It Takes Two, with Undertale back in the day. Like there is this very dedicated group of online weirdos that just love watching let's plays of certain games, like highly specific games that are popular among online communities. And I think Baldur's Gate 3 absolutely falls into that metric because in reality, Baldur's Gate 3 is not popular at all, right? It doesn't have a wide enough player base. The people who did buy it don't like it too much. It wasn't relevant enough to leave much of an impact in the gaming space. But like the way the online community tells it, oh man, it beat Zelda its absolute best. It beat all these other games. It beat Spider-Man. It beat Hogwarts Legacy, even though it didn't. Like it did all this stuff, right? Baldur's Gate 3 forever until the next game comes out, right? Like it's the same thing we've always seen from the community, right? Like something comes out, it's worshipped as the best thing ever, and then it's immediately tossed aside when the next thing comes out, right? And um, with Baldur's Gate 3, it's interesting to kind of see that process of people like Phil just playing through the game like casually, just to have an opinion on it, just to say he played it, and he's coming to the same conclusion that I came to. It's that like, yeah, this game does not look as if it's worth my time, right? Like if I was left to my own devices, if I was actually just playing the game by its own merits, I would never touch it, right? I am only playing this for money. Now, Phil is interesting because Phil is like the thing about Phil, and I think the major thing that sets him apart from most major content creators is that he'll tell you why he does certain things. Like he'll tell you about the business and how much money he's pulling in and how much he does. Like Phil is a content creator who says the quiet part out loud, right? Phil is currently covering Baldur's Gate 3 for the same reason that everybody else covered Baldur's Gate 3, because they thought it would make them money, right? So Phil just jumps on the bandwagon. He worships it. It's like, Phil jumps on the bandwagon. He plays the game. He's covering it, but once he makes his money, once he's like left to his own devices, once he's like in a position where he feels comfortable, like he is going to start criticizing the game because he's made his money on it already, right? He makes the bulk of his money through views and donations. So like once like he's through with the game and he can look back on it, like he's just gonna trash it because obviously it's a mediocre experience that cannot like live up to any kind of real expectations from someone who actually knows what a good video game is, right? So with that in mind, yeah, I am on DarkSydePhil's side here. I do support him in this endeavor. Like I do think that Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the most disappointing situations I've seen in recent years. Right? I do think this is like going to be the beginning of the end of the generation. I kind of look back on 2033 as like the beginning of the end uh of like the Switch's like golden years period because it felt like in 2023 that like and especially even in 2022 like it felt like the gaming media was trying really hard to downplay the Switch because they needed to prop up the next generation of platforms and they needed to prop up all these new games that weren't coming to Switch, so they were no longer like talking positively about the Switch or its software, right? Like that's kind of the feeling I get now is that like Baldur's Gate 3 was propped up purely as an anti-Nintendo thing, right? And it's not going to stick, right? Like I do think it's already started happening where like people are kind of acknowledging that like yeah, Tears of the Kingdom was better than this, there were better titles released that year, right? Like Mario Wonder has been a huge hit. Like the coping and seething that everybody had in regards to Baldur's Gate 3 has kind of fallen apart by this point. Like people have played the game, people have been disappointed by the game. Like people aren't going to be gaslit into thinking this is some like top tier next gen exclusive when it's just like a D&D game that could have come out like 10 years ago, right? With choppy animations and just uh, like Baldur's Gate 3 is not impressive. Is what I'm trying to say here, and DSP was totally right.